Originally, you were going to see a film on immigration. It never arrived. So you had me. And this is part of a presentation of a symposium at Fontbonne University on 23rd of October, so just about over a week ago. It was a symposium on collective memory in St. Louis, recollection, forgetting, and common good. And I had made this proposal, certainly to give an oral history of Catholic Latino ministry in St. Louis Archdiocese and its implications for contemporary developments. And part of the reason I wanted to do this was because I'm very aware, I was here 20-some years ago, and I was working in Hispanic ministry at that time, and those people who had begun the ministry are now up there in age. They're in their 70s and 80s. And I wanted to get an opportunity to interview them and get a feeling for them in the development of Latino Hispanic ministry in the Archdiocese. So when I say it's an oral history, it was part of those interviews and trying to find out what is going on presently from that development in regards to Latino Hispanic ministry. And that development begins with the 1980s until the present. And when I looked at what were the implications for the future development of Latino Hispanic ministry. So the interviews were done with original players from the initial ministry and who began basically Hispanic ministry in household meetings, developed into the present situation where there are several parishes which offer Spanish Mass and some who have begun to offer pastoral services as well. The St. Louis Hispanic Ministry Office has gone through various developments and dealt with several changes over these years. It began with a bi-monthly liturgy being offered at St. Francis de Sales Church, and has developed with various churches now dispersed throughout the Archdiocese, both in the city and in the suburbs. This movement has been lay-driven, assisted by religious men and women, but predominantly situated today in diocesan parishes run by secular priests. Consequently, these have evolved into particular and dispersed ministries, some limited by their parochial nature. And so the questions that I had, at what stage of development is the Latino immigrant population in the St. Louis region? And some of the things that I found is clearly there is a unique pattern of dispersed rather than centralized growth in Latino immigration. How does this history impact in facilitating this development? Is there a unique history of the Archdiocese that has affected the development of Hispanic ministry? Certainly there are specific problems that have plagued these developments in the ministry. And is there a wider regional vision necessary for continued development and expansion? So I felt it was important to begin with looking at demographics because I think there's nothing better than pictures, and a lot of what you will see in this PowerPoint is pictures to summarize a lot of information. So in looking at the demographics of Latinos, Hispanics in the Archdiocese of St. Louis, what you find is certainly in regards to the state, that in the last, from 2000 to 2008, there was a 3% increase in regards to Latinos in the state of Missouri. Compare that to Illinois, where it's a 15% increase. So you see that there hasn't been a large increase in comparison to all the southwestern states. California, 37%. God knows what states those are. 38%. And then Florida, 21%. And certainly, I think that's Pennsylvania way up there, 17%, or God knows, it might be New York. So anyway, But I just wanted to nationally that there's been an increase in the population in the last, from 2000 to 2008 by 15.4%. 9 states have greater national average percent of Hispanics than Missouri. And Hispanics are only 3%, as I mentioned, in Missouri itself. So the percentage growth from 2000 to 2008. If you look at it, it's only 3% of the population in Missouri in terms of Latinos, but there was I gave you a wrong statistic. There was a 60% increase in the last, from 2000 to 2008 in Missouri. A 60% increase. Nationally, the growth was 33% during that time. Every state grew its Hispanic population at least by 13% in the last 8 years. Those are very important statistics. States with the lowest percentage of Hispanic persons generally had the highest growth in Hispanics. So that's why Missouri had such a large growth, because it had a very small population. But if you see in the Bible Belt, there was a tremendous growth in Alabama, Mississippi, all of those states in terms of Latinos. And then this state there, which is South Dakota, had a very large percentage, 93%. But if you start to look at where the growth is in the St. Louis area, particularly the Archdiocese, you start to see that the major growth begins from the city itself going northwest. So then it goes to St. Louis County, St. Charles County, and Warren County. Those are all the counties going west and northwest of the city. Okay? There's been growth in all of the counties, but particularly in those are the largest growth. Then when you look at the Hispanic population of the Archdiocese in the 4 largest counties, what you find is that the original church, as I mentioned, where the Hispanic ministry office was St. Francis de Sales. But St. Cecilia's was the other parish where they'd grown, and Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is up here on the north. And so, once again, what you see is that pattern of growth going northwest throughout the Archdiocese, but centering itself in certain parishes, certainly in the inner city. But notice, in the inner city right now, we're speaking about St. Cecilia's. So really, most of the growth has been west and north of the city, not central to the city. Why is that? It's not unique. When I was in Minneapolis, the growth of the Hispanic community predominantly showed the same pattern. That it's moved away from that pattern where it's centralized in a city and moves out into the suburbs as it continues to grow. So it's no longer just centered in what you would call the Latino or Hispanic ghetto. It's throughout an archdiocese, throughout a region, and usually due to employment possibilities. So the Hispanic population of the Archdiocese, and these are the westernmost regions of the Archdiocese. You see in the north there's been more growth certainly than in the south, but not anywhere near as you see in those central areas closer to the city and to the airport. And here you find that the greatest growths have been in All Souls, Holy Trinity, St. John the Baptist, St. Jude, and Our Lady of Presentation. All of those are predominantly in the suburbs. They're not in the city. So they're away from the main St. Louis itself. This is probably the most important graph that I can show you, which is the future growth of Latino school-age children. If you look at the preschool, which is the green part on the left side, and you see that even if the number of Latino births remains constant for the next several years, there will be a 50% more elementary school age children in the Archdiocese by 2018. There will be 120% more high school age Latino children by 2022. So on the right side is the high school children. Those have only begun to increase recently. But the projected growth is a continued growth throughout the elementary school in regards to children. But an important statistic is that I'll give later is more specifically that 50% of Latinos are children 17 and under. 50% of the population. Now, let me give you some specifics in terms of my findings that I found more important in regards to Latino Hispanic parishes in St. Louis and the challenges in their development. First of all, there has never been an Archdiocesan Hispanic Latino plan developed. The Archbishop was in our house on Monday, and he said that himself. But in all my conversations with the people who have been there, there's never been an Archdiocesan plan that has been worked and developed in this Archdiocese. In every diocese, whether it was Denver or Minneapolis that I was at, there was at least a plan to work from. And thus, because there's never been a plan, number two, there is no coordinated Archdiocesan Hispanic Latino formation plan for new ministers or programs in Spanish. They have what you call typical hodgepodge courses that sooner or later that someone will give it. It's not coordinated in terms of a certificate or a program. And because it's not programmed, what you find is lay people giving lay people a workshop or a class without major development themselves. And so even those who give the workshops is not coordinated. There's no systematized formation program in the Archdiocese. The third point is that Hispanic Latino parishes development is augmented by a lack of collaboration among Latino parishes and pastors in the Archdiocese and regionally between the diocese and the area. That's my as I ask questions, as I continue to look and find out, and also as we attempted to do that this past year by gathering ministers from St. Louis and Belleville and Springfield, and I was kind of shocked that had not been done before, and also shocked at how quickly it was undermined. Fourth, the majority, if not all, the parishes are pastored by diocesan priests. Why is that so unique or different? My experience in Denver, my experience in Minneapolis, diocesan priests are very good in their parish. They have a real difficulty collaborating between parishes and sometimes in the archdiocesan level unless they are pushed to by their own bishop. And so one of the pastors said, "This is my territory, leave it alone." That's not an untypical attitude. It's a real individualistic mentality. So it reminded me of an article many years ago that I read by Joseph Fitzpatrick, the Jesuit, who had worked with the Latino communities in the East Coast, where he said in an article, you have diocesan priests raised in middle-class families who are disassociated from the socioeconomic reality of poor working-class, new, and I would add, undocumented immigrants. Thus, there is a lack of understanding of the new, today even more so, what I would call clandestine underground immigrant. Because if you know anything in terms of what's going on in Hispanic communities throughout the United States, when they had that big mass demonstrations throughout the country for immigration, all of a sudden there was a strong invasion of the community by ICE, which is immigration and customs agents, knocking at their doors early in the morning, which terrified the community and has gone underground, and most of the time they want to remain invisible. So within that context, you have a ministry with tremendous needs and a lack of any coordination. The other part is that many of the priests don't understand the whole concept of developing of new immigrant communities. It's not the first. The Latino is one of many immigrant groups that have come to the United States, but there's a whole process of development that happens and can enter into either, and I've been in situations where I've been called basically to mediate disaster that's happened, an inability for two communities to work together because there was no coordination between a pastor and his vicar, and the English community and Spanish community conflicted because they did not understand the dynamics going on of how do you bring together different communities in regards to culture and language and so forth. So the issues of multiculturalism, of ethnic or joint parishes, how do you do them? How do they work? How is that possible? Where are the conflicts going to be? There's a lack of understanding of that process. Fifth, poor preaching due to language skills. I've never seen more atrocious preaching than I have seen in my experience in visiting some of the parishes, and particularly in Spanish. Not only is the language poor, but even when they know the language, they totally do not understand the context of the people and the Latino people who have come here as immigrants. And so they constantly either shoot over their head or don't shoot at all. It's almost sad and embarrassing. That's pretty sad when you hear this statistic. 1 out of 3 Catholics will leave the church, meaning 1 out of 3 Catholics will become either a mainline Protestant, an evangelical, or some other church member of some other church, according to a study done in February 2008 by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, U.S. Religious Landscape Survey, based on interviews of representative sample of 35,000 adult Americans, reported that 1 out of 3 adult Americans who were raised Catholic have left the church. Of these ex-Catholics, if these ex-Catholics were to form a single church, they would constitute the 2nd largest church in the nation. Thomas Reese, who's a Jesuit, former editor of America Magazine, recently described this loss of 1/3 of those raised Catholic as a disaster. He added, "You wonder if the bishops have noticed." So the majority of Hispanics and Latinos are predominantly very understanding. I'm amazed at how tolerant they can be, how hospitable they can be, how patient they can be, coming back Sunday after Sunday. But they are also part of that 1/3 of the population that's leaving. It's my experience. Wherever I've been in terms of diocese, it's my experience in my own family, where my parents brought us up Catholic and they now are evangelical. So number 6, another thing that dioceses have done, which has not worked, is importing foreign priests from Latin America, from Latin American dioceses, or young seminarians from other countries. I've been in Minneapolis. Some biggest disasters have happened because of that. And in Denver it was no different. You bring priests who you don't know their background, you don't know why the bishop's so generous in letting them go, and you also know that they don't understand what it is for a Latino to grow up as a Latino in the United States, and its structures in terms of education, its structures in terms of social services, the needs and the conflicts within the families in terms of enculturation and so forth. They don't understand those issues. They They also don't understand the issues of immigration and employment and education. So how do you help a people if you don't understand their central issues within a new cultural context? So my 7th point in this part in regards to challenges and development is that the Archbishop's role in the church is important and central, is my experience. I've seen where naming of directors without sufficient authority to influence the structure of individualism and pastors' fiefdom doesn't work too well. And so, many times resources for education and ministries are not available or provided. And so sometimes I ask myself the question, are directors named to control and not necessarily to develop? I've had that experience, certainly in 2 dioceses that I've been near to, is the way I'll put it. Not in this one, with this Archbishop, but certainly in diocese. So I want to go into another major, tremendous challenge, which is the access to higher education. Because if you look at theological schools, they were created for the most part to educate religious leadership. Since the invention of the Association of Theological Schools, they have educated the majority of professional theologians and ministers in the United States and Canada. Access is an issue for some racial ethnic minorities. The Association of Theological Schools offer degree programs that require students to have a bachelor's degree to be admitted. The Spellings Commission cited the following data as the basis for its concern about access to American higher education. By age 29, 34% of whites have obtained a bachelor's degree, 17% of African Americans, 11% of Latinos and Hispanics. The largest issue of access to ATS schools for racial ethnic minorities is the differential rate of the baccalaureate completion. There are 2 ways to consider enrollment of racial ethnic students in ATS schools to determine problems related to access. The first is by comparing enrollments in theological school to enrollments in a similar programs of higher education. The second is to compare the percentages of racial ethnic percentages in the general population. And as to the first, ATS enrollments of racial ethnic students approximate the enrollments of U.S. graduate students and first professional degree programs, the national category that most closely parallels ATS degree programs. In 2005, ATS schools in the United States had a higher percentage of African American students, 12.2% for ATS schools compared to 12.3% in U.S. graduate and professional degree programs. A lower percentage of Hispanic Latino students, 4.1% in ATS schools compared to 5.9% of United States. And similar percentages for Asian students, 6.2% in ATS schools and 6.5% in U.S. And Native peoples, 0.3%, less than 1% of ATS and 0.5% of U.S. graduate degree programs. As to the second method of comparison, ATS schools in the U.S. enroll African American at about the same percentage as their presence in the population. 12.2% of ATS school enrollment to 12.8% of the population. Asians at a higher percentage than their proportion of the population, 6.2% and 4.3% of their U.S. population. And Hispanic Latinos at a dramatically lower percentage than in the general population, 4.1% of ATS enrollment to 14.4% of the population. Today, the second statistic is 15.3% of the population. The data suggests that Hispanics have special problems with access to theological education. Three issues are likely most responsible for the underrepresentation of Hispanic Latino students in theological schools. The first is the baccalaureate requirement for admission. The Hispanic community has the lowest percentage of baccalaureate degrees holders of any racial ethnic group in the United States, and that's only getting worse, not better. Many ATS schools with special programs for Hispanic students have reported that their biggest recruiting problem is the baccalaureate degree requirement. The second issue is a relatively large percentage of Hispanic Latinas who are Roman Catholic or Pentecostal. Roman Catholics have a low percentage of participation in theological schools, as determined by the ratio of the total membership in the U.S. Church to the Roman Catholics enrolled at ATS schools, and Pentecostals who do not require a graduate degree for ordination or ministerial service. In the last month, I was at a meeting of ATS in Pittsburgh of first-year professors. There were 4 professors there that were Latino out of about 75. What I found was, of the 4, there was one Roman Catholic, myself, another one who was Presbyterian, another one who was Lutheran, and another one who was Christian. All of them were Puerto Rican. There was not one Mexican. And none of them was, of the other ones were Catholic. But all of them predominantly have been educated in Puerto Rico, except myself. Because the standard of education there is higher. But all of them were, out of the other 3 who were not Catholic, 2 were former Catholics. So 2/3 of the others are, let's say, one I wasn't sure what he was, if he grew up Lutheran or if he had been a Catholic converted to, but the other 2 I was able to ask. But notice what I said earlier in regards to 1/3 of Catholics leaving the church. And so what you're having is, if 1/3 of Catholics are leaving the church and joining other churches, what part of that is the brain drain also going on within the Latino community? So that was almost scandalous to me, particularly because 65 to 67% of the Latino population in the United States is Mexican. The third reason for not getting a degree or graduate degree is Spanish is the first language for many Hispanic Latinos. English is the second. The technical terms associated with advanced studies and theological disciplines can be difficult for English speakers, let alone persons who speak English as a second language. 2/3 of all schools of theology in the U.S., also if you look at where the schools are in comparison in the United States and in Canada, 2/3 of them are located in the eastern third of the country. In other words, on the other side of the Mississippi. 2/3 of theological schools, whether it's in the United States or Canada, are on the other side of the Mississippi. Thus, they're not accessible to the areas of greatest population growth of the new ethnic minority groups in the population. California, Florida, Texas, the whole Southwest, if you saw in the beginning charts, in terms of population growth. Across access of critical importance for theological schools, and then they cannot serve the educational needs of the communities of faith if the persons those communities need as leaders cannot attend a theological school in their area. Because as you know, many of you in your own experience, in order to attend an infamous theological school, you have to work. You have to have a job. You have to pay for it. If you have to leave where you've grown up and where your job is, what's the chance of getting a theological education? So what strategies would increase access? If ATS schools began offering theological education at both the bachelor's and master's degree levels, that would create access for many. This information is coming from Eoshire, who is a major educator in the ATS schools, and is saying we need to do something or we're going to lose a whole generation and a whole group, which is the largest increase in generation. The real access solution may be to provide the kind of education that racial ethnic students most need to serve in settings where they are most likely to minister. Most of them are not going to leave their jobs in order to get an education. They barely can hang on to jobs today. Currently, the Catholic population of the United States is comprised of 39% Catholics who are Latinos. That's a statistic by the U.S. bishops, with nearly 50% of this Latino group being children and youth. What are the challenges within the Latino community, the parishes, the diocese, the theological education to assist in this development? I think that's what I tried to develop, is to give you a picture that we have a lot of challenges. What contributions is this relatively new immigrant community making to the Catholic culture of St. Louis? Family is central. Staying with family, staying connected to family, struggling in the poorest of jobs to stay together is central. The whole immigration situation does not help it. I've seen a tremendous amount of suffering because of it. The new Archbishop Robert Carlson has stated that in 10 years, 52% of the Archdiocese will be Latino. If this is true, there is an urgent need for more direction in regards to this ministry. What models can assist the development? How can we engage in significant planning in the diocesan or regional level to provide for a rich development of Hispanic Latino ministry in this Archdiocese? Those are questions that we still have to answer and work on if we in any way want to make an impact on the future of the church in St. Louis. So, thank you. Are there any questions that you would have from what I love?
I have my question. When you said about the poor in the way the people have been preaching, or the priests have been preaching, what do you think will be the solution for to have a good preaching for us, with the people who like to hear a good preaching in Spanish?
I think there's two things. One is that we definitely, the church has always been in its difficulty in terms of preachers. It's not a new thing. That's why Dominic came into being, order of preachers, because preaching was always kind of poor. So I think, one is to gather priests and say, how can we improve what we do? And then how can we improve what we do to specific issues and communities? Because, I've gotten the attitude that I'll never preach on immigration, whether it's in English or Spanish, because priests are afraid of preaching on difficult issues. And so I think one is, if they're good preachers, there's no reason why they can't preach on issues so that the whole other people are aware of it. But it's how do you get people to preach on what are difficult issues, and immigration is just one of them. The death penalty is another one. There's all kinds of issues that are difficult to preach, but priests are afraid because they don't want to rile up their troops. But certainly in regards to racial ethnic preaching, which I think is another issue, one is I think the important things are, it's not about language alone. It's also about culture. Do you really understand the social, cultural, ethnic reality or racial reality of your community? And if you don't, what do you need to learn, and what will facilitate that learning for you in order for you to direct yourself and having images or talking about the issues of that community? Because if you're not doing that, it's sort of like you're shooting past them. And then the other one certainly is language. If you know some Spanish, can you continue to work on it? I've seen priests give up. In other words, they learn enough to say, a few words to people, but they kind of stop because they feel inundated with the pressures of the ministry. And I understand that. I mean, it's a natural thing to do. But when you stop, you always undermine yourself, but you undermine your community, because if your community isn't hearing you preach, and particularly if it's being done poor, or if you don't have some way of facilitating that improving by having someone help you, then it's not going to improve. But the other thing is, it's all those wonderful documents that we have on preaching that talk about the reality that if you can't preach well to this population or this group, like to children, like to ethnic groups, then is there someone capable within the parish that could be trained, who already speaks the language and understands the culture?
Or women or sisters.
Notice I'm trying to
I know.
leave it wide open there, but exactly. And I think that's what I'm finding is that if you can't do it, then why is the church not being fully fed? It's like you go and have half the loaf, or a loaf without yeast, or a loaf without, it's like, how would you like to go to a meal and just have bread? Okay? I mean, it's wonderful, but I'm not in jail. So you should probably get bread and wine, or you should probably get, more than what you are getting. And so there are mechanisms, there are documents there that allow that, but I think in our being fixed, we're killing a community. We're killing the future. And there are so many talented people out there, but there are so many that can be trained if given the opportunity, who will come up, and that's my experience. What I find is a hunger for learning. It's not a lack of a hunger for learning in the community. It's a hunger for learning, but not being given access and not being provided with the tools and the resources and the finances. So I visited enough parishes to see good and bad preaching. I've also seen why evangelicals in other churches have a step on us, and it's because they might do bad preaching, but they're doing preaching that hooks you in. And believe me, I've sat there and been furious as I've heard it, but I notice that people are reacting to it, and I'm saying, but we have all the education and all the tools to educate people to do it. They don't have to be ordained necessarily, but they have to be designated to be said they can do it because there's a need. And our documents allow that. Yes?
I don't know if there are any numbers or any data to answer the question I'm about to ask them, but is there any information, or even just anecdotally in your experience, in terms of U.S. Hispanics who, let's say, having a higher degree, let's say a graduate degree, having that level of education, being somewhat middle class, and a correlation between that and maybe, is there a higher likelihood of such individuals to leave the church? Are the numbers higher there than they would be for, let's say, somebody with less education and that sort of thing? And I'm wondering if there's any connection there and how that affects this whole situation.
Yeah, what I would say is, it's hard to know, but like when I talk to these professors from these other schools, they had gotten their education in Catholic schools. And they converted, one because of marriage. He thought it was easier because his wife was already, Presbyterian, for him just to change over. And, he already had a good education and could continue that education. And that's what I'm finding is that sometimes it's because of a partner, but other times it's because they can get married. And we're making that a major roadblock in terms of this whole community as well. And so it's kind of sad and frustrating because you're seeing, the talent moving away. Yes?
Are you seeing a difference? And I came in late in the presentation, so I'm very sorry that I might have missed this. But are you seeing a difference in the pastoral needs of Hispanic Catholics, Latino Catholics, who are immigrants, who were born in another country, from those who are second, third generation, and so on, maybe even now down the fourth generation. How different are their specific, I guess, pastoral needs? And are you finding, as you do with other ethnic groups in the United States, that there's an assimilation factor going on by, like, particularly the third generation, with intermarriages or marriage outside the ethnic group, and so on.
Yeah. What I find is that Latinos tend to hang on to their language and their culture longer. So it'll go into the second and third generation, unlike a lot of groups that usually by the second it's gone. They hang on to it longer, but if they have not made a connection in that first generation with the church, they're not going to be Catholics. There's too many other options. And particularly because then you start getting married and intermarriage, and then it becomes easier to let go. Because you've never, if you haven't by adolescent made a strong investment or connection in your faith, most of the time, either through marriage or something else, you will switch over. And that's why I think for us not to address this when we have such a large population of children. The other thing I found was the poor faith education and coordination of faith education throughout the diocese. There's no coordination of it. It's all, even RCIA, which for me is how you build your future leadership. I found out a couple of parishes have made attempts at doing it, but they don't know how to do it. They do it as a program, not as a process. And so that one way that you develop your adult to become ministers is just not going on in this Archdiocese. They haven't even had a workshop on it. And I'm just like, how do you create leadership? Let me give you an example. When I went to one of the parishes here, I found the same ministers 22 years later that I found when I got here. The same ministers, teaching baptism, being Eucharistic ministers, and being lectors. I was so scandalized. I said, there is no future if there is no development of ministers. And that's it's almost a crime. It's a crime to heaven for our children and our future and our church. It just astounds me. It astounded me when I went to this parish when I saw that. So there's some, but there's very little. There's tremendous hunger. But who's going to put direction?
Jose, given that it would be a rich experience for us to have Hispanic people in our classrooms, could you put your finger on anything that a Hispanic student and Hispanic professor contribute to the process of doing theology in theological school, that perhaps as a piece of the puzzle that other groups, other ethnic or cultural groups would not have, that they would have? What kind of contribution could they make to doing theology by their social context, by their religious expression, by anything?
There's two or three things I can think of immediately. One is, if you know Latinos, there's a whole sense of joy and celebration and fiesta, and that's a communitarian thing. It's not an individual thing, but very communitarian. So that's very central to the culture. It's that sense of celebration of life, and community. And life is in the context of community. You belong to a family. You belong to and it's an extended family.
When we tend to be very individualistic.
Exactly. It's not individualistic, and that's part of the difficulty of going to college too. Because going to college means that you will have to uproot yourself many times to go away from the family. That's very hard. So another thing I can think of is certainly that they're also very, Latinos and Hispanics are very traditional. In other words, I'm sorry, if you see a cross in church, Jesus hasn't resurrected. He's still with suffering. He's still on that cross. He's still nailed there. They want to see the blood and the guts because That's their experience. That's an immigrant's experience. If you see in Latin America, sometimes I want to gag myself because I hate seeing those stuffed Jesuses and, all the blood and the guts, but that's the spirituality. So it's very traditional. And, for them to, for you to have a resurrected Christ, which is very American, resurrected Christ in the Latino communities is like, when did that happen? They identify with the suffering Christ. That's where they're at. And so they add that because why? Because that's where their experience is. But there's also a richness in that. It means you have to go deeper. And I think that's a gift that they bring. You go deeper. And part of going deeper is when you have an experience of cultural conflict, you have to go deeper in order to retain who you are. And so I think that's why I mentioned earlier, it takes more generations for us not to be invested as Latinos. But that's a richness too. Because I think many Europeans find it is until the second or third generation that they start looking at their ethnicity or their background and their history and their family tree. Well, we're struggling with it and trying to keep it because we find the value, of keeping that connection to the grandparents or the parents and so forth. So it's a very family, centered, and that's a strength and it's a weakness. That's probably why we don't have a lot of, there's also the pullback on education. So I don't know that answers.
Yeah.
Other questions or issues? Yes.
So far, how have you found Bishop Carlson in terms of looking towards this future with the increasing Hispanic population?
I have to say I've been tremendously impressed. He's come and spoken to our community here twice, and I've spoken with him individually once. When I went to see him, I had in a folder with me a plan for evangelization, and I said no, I should give this to him because specifically for Latinos, because I said I may be preempting and probably he needs to get to know me. Well, wonderful. On Monday this week, he was talking about that's a central goal of his in terms of a pastoral plan for the whole Archdiocese is on evangelization. So I said, well, I'll send you a copy of what I had in my folder, because I really I've felt, because that's what I've done in the parishes that I've been in, that if you don't evangelize, if you don't create the mechanisms for the community, then they will dissipate. Those are the hooks. They're the things that people need in their journey to have hope. And so if you provide, and evangelization is about that. If you provide that, and so I'm very hopeful with him. He's also said, 52% of before he leaves here will probably be Latino. And why? Because what you're finding is, once again, 1/3 of Catholics are leaving, but look at all these children that are Latino who predominantly would be Catholic, but are they going to be there in the next generation if they don't get what they also need?
This is really my own question, but I just want to throw it on to you in case you have anything to say about it. Liturgically, our community here consists mainly of people who don't speak Spanish, but we do have people who speak Spanish in our community, and we have you.
Yeah.
So
I speak Puerto Rican.
liturgically, do you ever wonder, frivolous way of putting it, do you ever wonder whether we could do something more in our liturgies that would be more multicultural than we are doing? Or is that too difficult for us whites to take on? And so we shouldn't go there.
In certain contexts, I would say that's too difficult. In this context, I think it's possible because I think there's a greater openness. Because hopefully that's what education is about, is it opens us to possibilities. And I think there's a lot of experience here, in different contexts as well. So I think it's just, here it's possible, I just don't think it's been explored or it's being done. And there's different moments where you can do that in a more active way, you know, or a more participative way, or a way to include it, you know, that lends itself, but I don't think we perceive. And the other thing is, I think whether it's Latino or Hispanic, or whether it's Vietnamese, or whether it's African American, we have other groups here that it would be nice once in a while for us to highlight, you know, that we have bigger diversity than what we express.
That's not to say we're not doing anything at all. Sometimes
Yeah, right.
there is a verse or two that comes out in a song in Spanish,
Maybe
or
it's a
maybe even in
rhythm.
another language.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anything else that anyone has? Yes.
How do we, as pastoral ministers, look at the Spanish-speaking communities that come to us and not conflate them all to the Mexican immigrant experience? I mean, there's such a, you know, you're Puerto Rican, she's Dominican. What do we do to not just say, okay, Mexicans, let's go?
I think that's a very good point, because an example, I mean, I predominantly have ministered in the Mexican community, but at the same time in Denver that I was helping this community grow in the Mexican community, I was ministering to a Caribbean community in another parish. And their music is very different. Their sense of celebrating in Eucharist is very different. And I say that because even here in a parish that I now help out at, there was a conflict between the Caribbean and the Mexican community, because the music is different. You know, it's different. That's the way I put it. And there was a conflict. Why? Because you have musicians that were used to playing rhythms that are much faster and much more different. And then you had, you know, the opposite, which was slower and more deliberate. And there was just a conflict between two cultures. But somehow, because the pastor, the ministers did not understand that, instead of both being able to coexist the way they should, you know, and saying, you know, can you do this twice a month and you do this twice a month? One group felt it needed to leave so that the other, which was now dominant, can take it on. And that's what happens, even within Latinos, you know, Hispanic Latinos, they can be divided that way, but a lot of times the ones who can help facilitate that don't understand what's going on, and they take them all to be the same. We're not all the same.
Yeah, I think in connection to that, it's also like, for instance, if you go to Miami, you have a very different experience, because there you will find, yes, you'll find, you know, very poor parishes and so on, but you'll also find upper middle class Hispanic parishes with upper middle class and wealthy people from different countries in Latin America. So it's, you know, the needs there are going to be very different than they would be in the kind of context that, you know, we're talking about here. But that's also, I think in the broader scope of just the United States overall,
Right.
Really what tends to predominate nationwide, not so much in one specific geographical area, tends to be more the immigrant, the sort of some of the issues that we're talking about, they're socioeconomically.
Right. So, yes?
Coming off of that even is that when you start thinking about liturgy and you start, it's way more than the music or whatnot, and so you have all these different cultures that come together. In Hispanic parish, you might have Puerto Rican and Mexican, then it's everything from the imagery, beyond the music, the imagery, the way the person, the speed of the person, all of that comes together, and that's what makes it so difficult.
Oh, yeah.
And it's not like there's any one Hispanic culture, and so
Right.
how do you bring all of that together into a worship that is keeping true to the culture of each of those individual groups, but enabling the parish to be able to then have a culture that becomes its own as well.
Yeah. I mean, an example on that is in Minneapolis, I had 1/3 of my Latino population was Ecuadorian. The other 2/3 were Ecuadorian, Central American. The other 2/3 were Mexican. Well, you know, it was how do you balance that? Because they all have their patron or their feast day or their virgin. And so I had my virgin corner, which is all the statues from different versions from different countries. And I said, they're all there? Because everybody wanted their corner, you know? And it was like, okay, fine, we can have the version corner. You know, so it's just, it was a respecting of the communities and celebrating their feast days at different times during the year. But that was important. And then I had one mass, which actually was predominantly Mexican, but I had Venezuelan couple who did the music, and the people were happy because they were using Pani Vida. And then the evening Spanish Mass, which is much more Mexican, you know, in terms of music. But you can have all that, and that rich tradition and mixture, as long as you respect it and you understand the differences, you know, and celebrate their feast days. People love it. You know, it's their time as a community to celebrate. I mean, I celebrated King Henry what is that big king? Not Henry, King Louis the 16th, I think it was? Yeah, you know, the big King Louis from France for the Ecuadorian community. I'm like, really? For the Ecuadorian community. But that was their feast day. So who am I to tell them, you know, it shouldn't be, you know, that's who they wanted.